There's one more thing you need to know about the monetary valuation of environmental goods and services, and that is, what are we valuing? And there's two concepts here. The first, willingness to pay, or more accurately, the Hicksian equivalent variation, is the maximum amount you would be willing to pay to secure a price fall, to gain something that you value. Willingness to accept compensation, or the Hicksian compensating variation, is the minimum amount you would be willing to accept to forego a price fall, essentially compensation for losing something that you value. So one scenario is you go into the supermarket for a pint of milk. How much are you willing to pay for that pint of milk? That's willingness to pay. Second scenario, just brought your pint of milk, you walk out of the supermarket, somebody bumps into you, you drop your milk, and it's spilled all on the floor. How much would you ask as compensation for losing this pint of milk? Those are the two concepts. Robert Willig, who you see here, showed in an older paper that the consumer surplus, or the change in consumer surplus, our common way of looking at these things, lies somewhere in between the compensating variation and the equivalent variation. And the reason for that, and the reason that the compensating variation is always larger than the equivalent variation, with the change in consumer surplus in between, has to do with an income effect. In willingness to pay equivalent variation, you give up some of your money to get something that you want, and that means that your budget constraint has gotten tighter, whereas in the compensating variation, your budget constraint has actually become looser because you're receiving money, and that is why the compensating variation is larger than the equivalent variation, with the consumer surplus somewhere in between. Willig also showed that the three measures are actually almost the same. And if the difference between gaining a pint of milk and losing a pint of milk, that is not going to change your budget constraints by a lot, and that is why the three are so close. And another reason that the three are so close is, if you drop your milk, you can just walk back into the supermarket and get a new pint of milk. So it's not as if you're losing something unique. Now, the way I talk about this is in quantities, whereas the older theory, is actually in prices. But Mike Hanneman has a paper out showing that you could actually do this in quantities just as you can do it in prices. So that is what people used to think. And now there's been a whole bunch of experiments where people measured first the willingness to pay for something, say a Mars bar or a coffee mug, and then they took that away. They took away somebody's Mars bar or somebody's coffee mug and estimated the willingness to accept compensation. They did that in controlled settings, estimated both, and theory predicts that the two should be the same. Well, here are the results of a meta-analysis of this particular phenomenon. And theory says, well, the value should be 1. If you take the ratio of the willingness to pay over the willingness to accept compensation over willingness to pay, the ratio should be 1. And there are indeed studies where it's relatively close to 1. But there's also a whole bunch of studies where the willingness to pay is 2 to 3 times as large as the willingness. No, the willingness to accept compensation is 2 to 3 times as large as the willingness to pay, or 3 to 4 times as large, and sometimes even more than 10 times as large, which is not what theory predicts at all. And it's a phenomenon that is persistent across studies, many different settings, many different experimenters, all found the same thing. So this seems to be genuine. The question is, why? What would explain this? Well, Willig already noted that there's one key difference, and that is the budget constraint, but that cannot explain why. One experiment that they did was they invited a group of students into a classroom to elicit their values, and when they walked in, they all got a coffee mug. And then the professor took the coffee mug away and offered to compensate the people That was one scenario, and in the classroom next door, the students were asked to buy a coffee mug. And the numbers involved there are so small that cannot possibly explain that this is an income effect. There must be something else at play. And the two things that people have thought about that may explain this difference has to do with voluntary and involuntary risks or effects. So if you are asked how much are you willing to pay for a coffee mug, then that's your choice. Whereas if you just got a coffee mug and somebody takes it away, that is involuntary, and you may just object to the fact that it's involuntary. Starker example, if you get drunk tonight and you get into your car, or you steal a car, and you get into an accident and you lose your leg, that is pretty bad. And you would be fairly unhappy with that result. Alternatively, I get drunk tonight, I get into my car, I get you into an accident, and you lose your leg. Objectively, it's the same. You lost your leg. You have only one leg left. That's pretty bad. But subjectively, it's not the same at all. The fact that you did something stupid and you got injured as a result is not the same as I do something stupid and get you injured as a result. And people do not just look at the outcome, but also in their evaluation of that outcome, consider things differently. The cause of a bad thing matters just as much as the badness of the thing. And you would also make a difference in the way you look at things if a little old lady in a small car gets you into an accident, or when a big fat rich guy in a big Mercedes gets you into an accident. You would also evaluate it differently, apart from the fact that you can perhaps extract more money as compensation from the second and from the first. You evaluate these things differently. So that may be one explanation. The other explanation, and is not necessarily exclusive, is that people attach value to the status quo. So a willingness to pay scenario could be you're at home at night, somebody comes and knocks on your door and tells a story about this parking lot down the road, and that they've got permission from City Hall to transform it into a park, replace the tarmac and the cars by grass and trees and perhaps a fountain. And they got permission to do so, but they haven't got money to do so. So now they're raising funds to actually make this happen, and they're asking you to contribute to that willingness to pay. Willingness to accept compensation is you are at home at night, somebody knocks on your door and says the City Hall plans to transform that park down the road, the grass and the trees and perhaps the fountain, into a car park, tarmac and cars. And they realize that this would cause nuisance to you, that this would damage you, and they're offering to compensate you. How much are you prepared to accept as a compensation so that you won't protest or something? That's a willingness to pay and a willingness to accept scenario. And objectively, the two are the same. Tarmac and steel versus grass and trees and perhaps a fountain. But they're not the same, really, because that park may be where you've walked your dog for many, many years. It may be where you kissed that girl. You may have fond memories of this. And they're taking not just the objective reality away, but they're also taking away the memories that come with that. And that may explain why people would demand a higher compensation than that they are willing to pay. Of course, there's also people who have romantic memories of car parks. That does not fully explain things, because also one of the things that I just told you, they also found this effect when they give students who walk into a classroom a coffee mug and then try to take the coffee mug away. Nobody in the 10 minutes that passed has any sort of emotional attachment to a coffee mug. If you have an emotional attachment to a coffee mug, then perhaps there's something wrong with you. This may be explained by power plays, right, between students and professors, but generally what people have found in both surveys and in experiments is that there is such a thing as loss aversion, that people have a bias towards the status quo and that they would like to keep the things that they have. And particularly if things are taken away by somebody else and they have no control over that, people do not like that. Now, why is this important for climate change? Well, a willingness to pay scenario is essentially that climate policy is about buying a better climate for your children or grandchildren. That is one way of looking at climate policy. And the impact of climate change would then inform your willingness to pay to do so. But you can also think about the impact of climate change as us compensating our children and grandchildren for the worst climate that we imposed on them. And that's a willingness to accept compensation scenario, and the answer would be very, very different. And what's more, the people who will suffer the worst impacts of climate change, typically the poor people, who also emitted the least amount of greenhouse gases. It's actually most greenhouse gases come from rich people, whereas poor people suffer the worst consequences of climate change. So there's also that going on, which suggests that if you study the willingness to pay for climate impact, you get a very different result than if you were to study the willingness to accept compensation for climate impact.